All right, welcome back. Let's get going for today. Thank you all for working on and completing your first application papers. My goal is to complete and return feedback to you on them by the end of this week. So thank you for getting those done. I really appreciate all of your hard work, interesting artifacts, and applications here. So we do have a second application paper that's just like the first one that I want to talk about in a little bit. And then remember that after you've worked on both of those, rather than a big like final exam or cumulative paper, I'm just asking you to choose one of those two papers to revise and expand on a little bit, and that'll be your final assignment for the class. So pretty straightforward as we're working through. We're in week number 7, so we've got some more theories to talk about this week and some more presentations, and then as we get closer to the end, you'll notice the schedule is a little bit different in the last couple of weeks, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So gearing up, we will be hearing from Logan today in just a little bit on the narrative paradigm. We'll be hearing from both Kate and Kenna on Wednesday about media ecology theory. And then we'll be hearing from Haley on Friday to discuss communication accommodation theory. The theories this week are a little bit eclectic. We've got one that's very focused on the rhetoric and persuasion elements that we've been talking about last week with the rhetoric and dramatism. Media ecology is much more focused on mediated and network communication, and communication accommodation is a bit more interpersonal. So there's a range in what to cover. You might consider one of these as options for your second application paper. So in kind of getting us through and thinking about some of this material, we spent some time last class hearing from Daniel and talking about dramatism on May the 4th, talking about Star Wars and other applications of how we create agents, scene, a story, and so on, and the ways that these different elements can shape our work. For today, we'll be looking at kind of at a glance the remaining weeks of the course, the narrative paradigm, and also hearing from Logan's presentation. Before Logan gets us started, I do want to take just a moment to talk a little bit about the second application paper and just some things to know as you're gearing up for the next few weeks of the course. So if you go to the course page on Canvas, you'll notice that under, I believe it's under week number 9, that application paper 2 is linked here. It should also show up as an upcoming assignment. So this is just like the first application paper in its length and its rubric and guidelines. I'm looking for the same thing, right? That you've chosen the theory of the class that you understand and that you're interested in, and that you've applied and used that to a relevant piece of communication or communication artifact. I do ask that you choose a different artifact than the one that you chose for your first paper, right? And also for this paper, the available theories are a little bit different, right? So you'll notice that some of the theories are ones we've been talking about over the last few weeks, ones like privacy management, groupthink, and organizational culture theory, rhetoric and dramatism that we discussed last week, this cluster for this week, and a few more after that. So you can choose any one of those theories. And again, the rubric is available here. This is due on May 25th, which is 2 weeks from Wednesday. Again, giving you more than 2 weeks to start to think about, plan, and work on that. I've also kind of noticed across the board that people tend to have an easier time with the second paper. And since you'll have my feedback by the end of the week, hopefully that will be useful for you as you're thinking about some changes or improvements that you could make as you gear up for that second paper. So that's coming up there. And just to give you kind of a quick glance of these remaining weeks, We do have a full set of readings and theories to cover this week, as well as next week. Under week 9, you'll notice that we are not meeting on Wednesday and Friday. That's for a couple of reasons. First of all, because you'll have that application paper due. And I, again, like to have that time reserved for you to finish up in the class right before it's due. I'm also going to be presenting research at a conference in Paris, so I will not be in town for those 2 days. But I do want to give you plenty of time to work on and wrap that stuff up. Memorial Day, we won't be meeting, and then we'll do our final 2 theories during week 10. Just as a reminder, we don't have any sort of face-to-face meeting for finals. A lot of people are out of town by then anyway, so we won't be meeting then, but I'll just be asking you to turn in that final paper by June 11th. So again, we're over halfway through the term. We all have done some really good work and participation in the class so far and thinking us through these theories. As we gear up for the end of the term, are there any questions about the second application paper, about the course at this point, or anything else? Okay, great. And again, I would just ask that if you know that you're pretty swamped with work and you have limited time to complete the second application paper, that you let me know if you need an extension. But we can advance, so a week from Wednesday be what I would ask you to let me know if you need some more time there. Okay, so since we have covered that, we will hear from Logan, who is getting us started in thinking about today's theory, the narrative paradigm. All right, you are welcome to click or use the arrows to move the feet.
All right, so like you said, I'm going to be introducing narrative paradigm. So narrative paradigm was a theory originated by Walter Fisher in 1987. The theory promotes that humans are natural storytellers and that values, emotions, aesthetics, and morals, they all kind of root themselves in our beliefs and our behaviors. Or, to put it more simply, humans are more persuaded by a good story than they are a good argument. So the assumptions of narrative paradigm is humans are naturally storytellers. We just naturally tell stories. Think of ancient history and mythology. That has all been stories passed down from humans. Decisions about a story's worth are based on the history, biography, culture, and character. These are known as the good reasons. These are the reasons why we like the stories we like, or we believe the stories we believe. We rationalize people's stories based on the consistency and the truthfulness we hear in the story, whether or not we think that what happened actually happened or it could happen. And we live in a world full of stories, and we have to sort out which ones matter to us and which ones we believe versus the ones that we kind of discard and don't believe. Key concepts of narrative paradigm are narration or narrative rationality, and coherence, and fidelity, which I forgot to put in there. So, we all kind of know what narration is. We hear all the time. The narration is any verbal or non-verbal account with sequences of events. The actions or words in the narration describe or recount information to the listener, who then assigns a meaning to it. So, obviously, we have the most classic Star Wars opening crawls. Those are a pretty easy narration where they just tells you what's happening, gives you a kind of a bullet point list of things that happen, and you as the reader / listener / viewer gets to create your own sort of communication information based off of this. Now, narration is considered to be all type of communication, and that's pretty broad, but that's the whole point. If all narration is communication, all communication is narration to us. Narrative rationality is how we judge which narratives we should believe or discard. While traditional rationality looks at actual facts and logic, narrative rationality focuses on using coherence and fidelity in the story. Using these two standards, we assess stories to see whether or not they are or should not be believed. That was right on my part. Coherence is the internal consistency and logic of the narrative. So if a story ever twists its logic or contradicts itself, we immediately lose confidence and or we don't believe it's true. Structural coherence is how smoothly and logically the events of a narrative flow. So a basic story, beginning, middle, end. Those stories make the most sense to us because we can understand the timeline and the logic in that story. a story that kind of warps around, starts beginning. Like whenever you tell your friend a story, and he keeps going back. Oh wait, before I say this, I gotta do this. Oh wait, before that happens, I gotta do this. That can mess up the structural coherence and make the story less believable. Material coherence refers to the consistency between multiple stories. So say you have two friends and they're telling you stories why they don't talk to each other anymore. If all the stories kind of follow the same path, same events, all that stuff, but one of the stories doesn't, it follows a different event, different information, you are most likely to disregard that story and just follow and listen to the other stories that all kind of sound the same, all have the same events. Because our brains naturally think that is how that should have gone, instead of that one story that was different. Characterological coherence involves the characters and how believable and relatable they are. So if you ever have a story or a character that is completely unrelatable, something that is completely not attached to us, something we can't relate to, we're gonna think about the story. Yes.
Oh, 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Fidelity is how truthful or relatable a story is. Fidelity runs on the logic of the good reasons, i.e. our culture, our morals, all that stuff. These are the reasons why we attach and believe our stories, because they follow what we think is right. Each person has reasons to which they believe their narrative. When a story has fidelity, the assigned meaning from the listener rings true and can persuade them. So when you believe a story, when the story is attached to you, you're most likely to believe and be influenced by this story. Which is why most stories live on, we always know what our favorite movie is or our favorite book is, because that story attaches to us because of the fidelity and the coherence attached to it. So the critiques, narrative paradigm is really broad. If it's all communication, it's really hard to test if it's true or not, because you have to test everything, which is possible. Not every story contains values and morals. This was a critique done back in the early 90s when sci-fi and fantasy started coming around, and the values, morals, and those kind of stories tend to be a lot more wonky and rare than ours. Fisher claimed that narrative paradigm theory has more influence in social structure than it really does. He thought it actually influenced society from a deep level out. Turned out not to be super true. It is hard for stories from other cultures or regions to meet our standards of coherence and fidelity. So when other movies or stories come from other cultures like Asia, Japan, it's a lot harder for us to connect and to relate to those stories. For example, one of my favorite movies of all time. Okay, understandable.
Here. Can I?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good example though. I just word about reference.
Understandable.
Okay, great. To cut you
That's
a little bit
okay.
short.
I knew this would be a long one.
No worries. But I am familiar with Howl's Moving Castle. It's a great Miyazaki film and a good example of how like storytelling from different cultures or situations can have a pretty big influence on our communication. All right. So Logan, thank you for getting us started and thinking about the narrative paradigm. I thought you did a great job of kind of really explaining in good detail and clarity a lot of these elements of this theory, how the narrative paradigm works, why the narrative paradigm is important, and some of the challenges of using narratives as a method of storytelling and persuasion. So thank you for getting us thinking about and really engaging in this topic. So as mentioned from Logan, right, the narrative paradigm argues that we are natural storytellers, right? That we're storytelling creatures, and that we tend to be the most persuaded by the stories that we hear and the way that those stories connect to our values and our beliefs, right? If we think about the trajectory of these theories that have been more rhetorical and public, right? They've kind of gone in a specific direction. They started with theories that were very focused on logic and kind of Aristotelian rhetorical persuasive strategies. You know, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man, right? And trying to use logical reasoning to persuade other people. And then we had Burke, who kind of said, hang on, Thinking about this in terms of a scene, an act, agent, and so on in a dramatic way might be a better way to think about persuasion. And now we're moving on to narrative paradigm. Walter Fisher actually helped to develop elements of dramatism, as well as creating this idea of the narrative paradigm, simply to account for the fact that the way that we think about persuasion, just as logical, just as based on appeals and so on, just doesn't quite work. In fact, oftentimes studies suggest that we are more convinced by stories and ideas that feel right or seem right to us, even if they're not necessarily factual, right? Storytelling can be a really powerful tool. In fact, one kind of really general way of thinking about the use of the narrative paradigm of storytelling is to think about the types of fables, stories, and tales that many of us have been told from a young age, right? One very classic example is a children's fable about the tortoise and the hare, right? We've heard this 1,000 times, but it's the idea that the tortoise and the hare want to do a race, right? The hare runs really fast, but gets tired and distracted in the middle of the race. The turtle just kind of trudges on and eventually wins. The moral of the story being slow and steady wins the race, right? And that's an example of a kind of fable or narrative that we're told from a very young age that is meant to instill a value or belief in us. That the idea of working consistently, even if it's not at a super fast pace, is a more effective strategy, whether it's negotiating work or classes or other responsibilities, than trying to rush through something and not do so consistently, right? And those types of stories that we see in many ways represent the values and beliefs of cultures, right? To get to Logan's point about how there's difficulty in translating stories between cultures, that's oftentimes because they're reflecting different viewpoints and perspectives. So in thinking about this theory, this, as mentioned, comes from Walter Fisher, who was a professor emeritus at the Annenberg School of Communication. Again, brought a lot in terms of dramatism and helping to adapt Burke's notion of dramatism into a full theory, as well as developing the narrative paradigm to make sense of stories and why stories matter to us. So a really important element of thinking about stories and how storytelling works is to think about a paradigm, right? If you are familiar with a term called a paradigm shift, that means that there has been a significant sea change in how we think about and discuss an issue, right? For example, Fisher has proposed the narrative paradigm as a paradigm shift in how we think about persuasion. Again, moving away from the Aristotelian rhetoric, logical persuasion style, right? This is known as the rational world paradigm. The rational world paradigm assumes that people will make the most rational or logical choice in any given situation. If you're choosing whether to go to school or to stay home, you would make that decision based on the resources you have available, your values, and so on under that paradigm. But instead, Fisher argues that stories, even if those stories are not entirely correct, are really powerful tools for us, right? That the use of storytelling and narrative is an alternative known as mythos, and that through our telling of stories, we become really compelled and engaged on particular issues. One example of this is comes from Joseph Campbell. Has anybody heard that name before? Joseph Campbell. So he comes from kind of a historical and mythological perspective, and he's famous for what is known as the hero's journey, right? Which is a narrative process that you can basically graft onto pretty much any piece of like fantasy type of media, right? That involves a hero or protagonist who goes through an array of challenges and crises, and as a result, emerges, develops, and encounters significant growth, right? Star Wars with Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy, or characters like Rey or Finn in the sequel trilogy, right, are examples of this kind of classic application. We could think about, a variety of films, including superhero films that tend to follow this arc too. You have a character who's a little bit reluctant or not the most confident, but builds their skills and confidence over the course of the film and develops, right? Last weekend, I saw the most recent Doctor Strange movie. It's an example of characters going through kind of growth and development over the course of the story, right? All the time, we see examples of this type of journey or arc for characters. And that type of journey that they go on, in many ways, is persuasive or engaging for us because of how narratives can impact our lives. So some of the assumptions here, right, as Logan was hitting on, that I want to touch on a little bit further. First of all, we're natural storytellers, right? If we think about sharing our experiences in our lives, things that have happened to us, there's a good chance that we put that in a story. Story typically includes beginning, middle, and end. It includes people or characters or actors. It includes some type of plot and action and something that happened, right? And it includes some type of resolution. For example, if we're telling a story about, what it was like in our first day of college, we parked in the wrong space, we rushed to get to class, we realized it was in the wrong building, we came in late, and we were out of breath, right? Generally speaking, we frame it as a story, even if it didn't unfold quite as easily when it actually happened, right? We oftentimes are interested in hearing stories from other people, and we might kind of repurpose, alter, or embellish our own experiences to try to fit them in a story a little bit more. We, of course, use media for storytelling as well. Decisions about a story's worth are based on good reasons. In other words, right, we try to determine whether the stories that we hear from other people are accurate or correct or believable based on the way that they connect to our own experiences and our evaluation of what we know to be true about those stories, right? So we might think about tall tales or stories that just don't quite add up, right? For example, my dad loved to fish and loved to tell stories about how he caught all these huge fish and had a great time. But he always did catch and release. We never got to actually see the fish he caught. And his friend told us that he didn't catch nearly the fish that he said he did, right? So oftentimes we are judging and questioning the accuracy of stories on that basis. Another example of some of the ways that we evaluate the truthfulness of stories was a case that came up a few years ago involving a news anchor known as Brian Williams, right? If you're familiar, Brian Williams would repeatedly tell a story about how he was involved in a downed helicopter, like a helicopter was crashing while he was in it, and was trying to report on a story while this crash was happening. It was eventually discovered that the story he told over and over never happened, right? And he was suspended from news coverage for quite a while on the basis of that story being inaccurate. Good reasons, right? Whether or not it's a good story is determined by a few different factors. One of them being history, right? So based on events of the past, is this true? Did this actually occur, or this helicopter crash actually happen? Biography, what do we know about the person and the person's own background? This goes back to Aristotle's definition of ethos, of credibility. Credibility matters when we're thinking about whether or not a story makes sense. Culture, right? As Logan mentioned, sometimes, depending on the culture or background that you're from, a story doesn't necessarily resonate or make quite as much sense. In fact, a lot of stories that are based on kind of individual achievement and overcoming an obstacle at an individual level are less popular, more collectivist cultures, vice versa. And character, right? What do we know about that person's own background, their propensity to tell the truth, and so on? The reason that Brian Williams' story about how he survived a helicopter crash seemed fine at the time was because he was seen as a relatively trusted and credible figure, right? But it was a matter of time that led to that story being seen as inaccurate. Rationality, right, is how we determine the truthfulness and consistency of the stories that we hear. And we experience the world and interpret the world as one that has a variety of different stories. And we choose among the stories available to us, right? One way of thinking about this is how would you describe the story of your life, right? You might talk about how you went on a different path in your life than you expected, but it worked out well for you. You might talk about why you chose to come to EOU, right? We are using stories to make sense of a lot of the chaos and bizarre situations that we find ourselves in, and to try to put them into patterns in a way that makes it seem coherent to us. Stories are, in many ways, depending on your interpretation, a kind of defense mechanism or filter that we do to try to manage or make more predictable our own experiences. So a really key element here then is how we're judging the stories that we hear, right? Because for a story to be persuasive, it needs to include these ideas of coherence and fidelity, which Logan touched on, but I want to talk about a little bit more. Coherence is this idea of internal consistency. So just to be clear, a story could be coherent, but it could lack fidelity. That is, a story could be really well structured, make a ton of sense, but also be inaccurate, and vice versa. A story could be true, but it could be told poorly. So when we think about the story, coherence involves structure, right? So structure means the story has really clear beginning, middle, and end. We understand and we can follow how the story is unfolding. If somebody like a friend is telling a story and all of a sudden they mention somebody like named Anna, you don't know who Anna is, they've never mentioned the name before, the story doesn't make sense because they haven't given you the information or context that lets you follow that story along, right? Or if you're a fan of kind of like non-linear storytelling or stories that kind of jump between parts, those are examples of stories that might not be super easy to follow structurally. Material, this refers to the idea that a story seems similar or seems consistent with other stories that you've heard, right? Again, if the story that you're hearing from somebody feels very different or very off from what you know about them or what makes sense to them to tell, you might be really skeptical. If your friend has always had terrible luck with fishing and suddenly they have this huge success story about how they caught a ton of big fish, right? We might doubt the material coherence of the story. And then characterological refers to the belief in or trust in the characters in the story, right? If we're watching a movie or we're reading a book or we're watching a show and we just cannot stand the main character, we don't find them identifiable or interesting or enjoyable, or we don't really like their motivations very much, it's really hard for us to feel very invested in what that story is, right? So the story has to make sense and it has to fit together within itself. And then also we have this question of fidelity. Does this story actually have truthfulness and reliability? Does it seem correct? Does it seem relevant to my life? And so on, right? So we make both of those determinations as we're hearing and filtering out the stories that we hear every day. So as Logan touched on a bit, this is a very broad theory, right? Again, we use a lot of stories to make sense of our lives, but what counts as a story, what fits within the structure of the story is open to interpretation. Another idea here is that this theory is really focused on a lot of kind of elite storytellers or people that have power or authority to tell these types of stories. For instance, we might think about in media, the writers, directors, and so on have that level of power or control. Or we might think about the broader cultural stories that we're oftentimes told. For example, right, the way that we understand history is often through the use of narratives and storytelling. Stories told about key figures in history over time. And, right, while storytelling and narratives are important, they're not necessarily the only way that we're persuaded. Sometimes we receive persuasive messages or campaigns or incentives, right? Carrots and sticks. We're motivated to do something because there's a reward or punishment for not doing something, right? So storytelling doesn't cover the full range of persuasion. And if we risk just boiling it down to storytelling, we're missing the boat on a lot of things. As mentioned, stories can be applied when we think about some of the fables or stories that we've been told from a very young age. Depending on your own culture or background, right, the types of stories or fables that you might have been told or exposed to over your life could be really different. If we think about a lot of children's television, right, oftentimes it has these types of fables and stories too. Again, Tortoise and the Hare is kind of a classic example of how the use of a story with characters is meant to give us a moral at the end, right? And then oftentimes the stories that we're told from a young age stick with us until the end, right? If we really think about it and we're like actually critiquing this idea of slow and steady wins the race, we have to take a step back. It's not something we do very often because we're told this story over and over again, and we come to accept it as fact, right? Oftentimes, right, especially at a younger age, our stories tend to be more persuasive than just being directly told to do something, right? Imagine being a kid and being told you need to be slow and steady, right? You need to work through things consistently. And they're kind of pointing their finger at you versus telling you a story with characters, with a plot that's interesting and kind of fun. That tends to be a lot better at getting our attention and keeping us engaged. So oftentimes stories are a much more convincing strategy for us. We can also think about this in the context of rhetoric, right? Oftentimes people will tell stories, including personal experiences and challenges, as a way of trying to relate to their audience and be persuasive. For example, if you watch just about any commencement speech at a graduation from like a high school or college speaker or valedictorian, in every situation, they're going to tell you something about their story, what their college experience was like, what classes they took, challenges that they overcame, and so on, right? And they use that personal experience and story about their own experience in college as a way of making that story persuasive and engaging to the audience of graduating students. So kind of using what we've been talking about here, about the narrative paradigm, and thinking back a little bit to what we were talking a little bit about last week, I want us to take some time in groups, and I'd like one person in each group to write or type for the group. And I want us to start by thinking about the rhetoric, dramatism, and the narrative paradigm last week. In what ways are these similar in how they're approaching persuasion? Again, these are all approaching rhetoric, public communication. And how are they different in terms of how they think about persuasion and the impact on our lives? What might be an example that your group can come up with of a narrative that's used as a persuasive argument? And then lastly, for a story to be persuasive, do you believe that coherence, whether it flows or makes sense internally, or fidelity, whether it's true or accurate, outside of the content of the story itself, is more important? And why do you believe one of those two is a little bit more important? So it looks like we've got 5. Okay. So let's do 3 groups of 5. So we'll do 1, Gavin, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So take some time to talk amongst your group. Again, have one person who will be writing or typing for your group with your names on that, and take some time to think through these questions and be prepared to talk about those a little bit.
All right. So the story sounds like it's true, it sounds like it's correct. I just think it is.
Getting them in front of a crowd and organizing an argument, putting in logic, emotion, and why should you trust me with my character? Whereas not and actual speaker would play, you kind of understand why he or she is doing what they're doing, how they're doing something. The dramatism for people is very important. You only see that with rhetoric. What they approach is how basically it works, and more about how you discover how it's working. And then the third is basically story. So like rhetoric, you can do Joe Biden, some president giving a speech. Whereas dramatism might be more like, why did this person call this? What kind of cause? Yeah, sorry. You like, if you're looking at the dramatism, you forward this 5 statements. You're basically looking at how all 5 statements.
Like deforestation.
And you can kind of discover.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah, they use inhabitants to persuade those.
Take about 4 or 5 more minutes. Do you think?
How about like the ant and the person? Whole based off table.
Because
Basically, it's
I often have stories that are
yeah, grasshopper.
weird.
Grasshopper.
So,
Play around. He likes to just kind of goof off, and the ant works hard, so if it comes like it's fed and safe,
I prefer when I do that.
yeah, it's a situation you work on.
But it's really perfect sense.
Yeah, story. Or to be a good story. Like we all know some words. But it doesn't stop a lot of people like the story. When you like,
Okay, we'll get another minute or two for you to finish up. And I'll ask one person from each group to share.
It's a lot easier to.
I was hearing some pretty lively discussions here regarding some of the ways to craft these things, including some debates about coherence versus fidelity, and some of the ways that we might find ourselves persuaded by stories that are not necessarily true, right? One thing that I think is useful and important for us to think about is, watching a film like Star Wars, it's not real, but we do have what's known as like a suspension of disbelief, right? Where within the context of fiction, we're thinking about whether or not the story makes sense or works for us. In fact, a lot of times when we become fans or excited about fiction, right? We're skeptically watching to make sure that what we're seeing fits with what we would like to see or what makes sense for us and what we know about the characters. So suspension of disbelief in fiction is the thing to think about here too. So let's talk a little bit about rhetoric versus dramatism versus the narrative paradigm and some of the ways that we can contrast those a little bit. Why don't we hear from the group here in the middle? What were some of the things that you all identified as the contrasts between these approaches?
They're all pretty similar in that I'm talking about how like you deliver a speech or refer to your audience. But rhetoric is more focused on organization and those types of techniques, whereas the narrative paradigm is more personal, and dramatism talks about delivery and the elements that go into public speech.
Sure. So if we think back to rhetoric, right, we can think about how the different parts that were laid out were things like invention, organization, memory, and so on. It's, as you were identifying, a really good way to structure a speech and to do this kind of public address to an audience, accounting for things like situation or context and giving a speech with those things in mind. Whereas dramatism, as you all were hitting on, is really a lot more focused on the sort of context, like about the scene, agent, agency, and so on. Thinking about it, like we're always kind of engaging in a stage. And then narrative paradigm in this idea that those elements, those claims supported by warrants, evidence, and so on, is not what persuades us, but the stories and tales that we tell each other are the things that seem to be more compelling, right? One thing that's, I think, important to think about too is that even if a story is fictional, that the ideas or values or beliefs that are reflected in that fictional narrative are the things that we find persuasive or convincing, right? That we see that even though a story is fictional, that it's somebody who's overcoming a major challenge or personal crisis through hard work, right? Might be a narrative that rings true for us based on that fictional example. So what would be an example of a narrative used for persuasive argument? Let's hear from this side.
So we said the Bible because it kind of like speaks in as like persuading you into like different beliefs and morals, I guess.
Sure. Right. So something like a Bible or some type of religious or spiritual text, right? And also like depending on the version, like Old or New Testament, Also thinking about, different ways that texts are seen as important or valuable differently, right? There's a lot of variation depending on religious views on what the types of texts or narratives are that are seen as really important, right? And that can also be an example of how different cultures tend to value narratives in different ways. So thinking about, what the texts or bodies of literature are that are seen as important or meaningful, and how those stories are told are really important ways that can guide a belief system or way of engaging. And of course, can be a major source of differences in how people interpret and make sense of a variety of issues, right? There's a film that recently came out that's called Belfast, and it's a discussion of sort of the Catholic-Protestant divide in Northern Ireland. And is a major example of how differences in religious beliefs can lead to a lot of disagreement and debate. And one of the interesting contrasts is how narratives surrounding things such as sin, sacrifice, and so on really differed depending on Catholic and Protestant communities that impacted the ways that those groups saw each other, right? So narrative can be really shaped by the beliefs and values of a culture, group, or set of beliefs. And then it seems like here on this side, there were some interesting discussions about coherence versus fidelity. What did you all settle on as being more important?
We settled on coherence as being more important because it has structure, something that way the person can follow what you're saying and better understand your perspective.
Right. So that's, I think, a good approach to take, right? If a story is told well, if it's organized really well, even if it's completely inaccurate, right? Oftentimes, because of how polished or clear or engaging the story is, we think, that must be right, that must be true, even though the story doesn't actually hold up. Again, it could come from a position of authority, or it could just be a story that's rehearsed and thought about really well in such a way that it comes off to other people as being true or correct, right? So, that's a good argument to be made. There's an argument to be made here too about fidelity, especially if people have access to things like fact checking or verifying the accuracy of information. So I think it depends a lot about context and situation. What can people find out about the truth? The last thing to think about here is a question of how verifiable the information is, right? So to what degree can people actually fact check or figure out if a story is true? If you're telling a story about the time you were alone in the woods and a bear was investigating your tent from the outside, sounds like a great story, but there's nobody else who can confirm that story, right? So that's a big factor there too. Narrative paradigm, if you're thinking about it in your second essay, you might think about how the way a story is told or the way a story is used has a persuasive element, right? So this is a useful theory for a paper if you're thinking not just about persuasion, but about how persuasive story is being used as a strategy. So to wrap up for today, we took some time to talk about the second application paper. Again, it's due 2 weeks from Wednesday, and involves any one of those theories from week 5 forward. We took some time to talk about sort of the power of storytelling and narratives that the narrative paradigm gives us, right? And how these different approaches to rhetorical and public communication assess persuasion differently. Again, with rhetoric looking very much about logical proofs, dramatism looking at a pentad and a stage type approach, and this theory in narrative paradigm looking at how we use stories. We'll be talking Wednesday about media ecology theory and some of the ways that we can connect in kind of a more mediated environment. So if you're interested in media as something to analyze for your second paper, you can definitely do so. So go ahead and either email or pass forward your attendance activities for today. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I will see you again in Wednesday's class.